right, welcome everyone to the CRC Roundtable, a monthly virtual webinar series where we host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. The webinars are designed for contribution, not just consumption, so each webinar invites a diverse range of researchers, managers, and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics. The point of this is to build connectivity between all of us, provide a place to ask clumsy questions, and increase our collective understanding for decision making. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists were given 25 minutes total for presentations, allowing a full 30 minutes for discussion. These webinars are recorded, and past webinars are available on the CRC website and the Roundtable's YouTube channel. So I encourage you to review these if you've missed some of our past conversations. As you enter, please type your name, organization, and location into the chat box so everyone can see today's webinar community. We ask that you stay muted with your camera off while our speakers are presenting. Then we like to start each webinar by asking why this topic, why now, and why these speakers. So in 2023, the Chesapeake Bay Program Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee released a report called a Comprehensive Evaluation of System Response, or as we lovingly call it, CSER. The report documents the committee's work to evaluate why progress towards meeting the total maximum daily load and water quality standards has been slower than expected, and offers options for how progress could be accelerated. One of the findings noted in the CSER report was that significant enhancement of living resources can be achieved through additional management actions without complete achievement of water quality standards across all habitats. The report goes on to note that actions in the shallow water, such as creating living shorelines and improving benthic habitat, can greatly increase living resource response to water quality conditions. As a result of this and other findings, the management community is considering how we might prime our shallow water habitats so that as improvement in water quality is made, we maximize the benefits to living resources. Now, this is a big topic with a lot of questions and information to unpack, and we are only a 1-hour webinar, so we'll not be able to address everything comprehensively, but we do aim to start a conversation. This will be one probably of many that we will have and that will be had around the Bay community. Today, we're going to look at what focusing on the shallows might look like in practice. Space and resources are limited, and there will undoubtedly be competition between things like submerged aquatic vegetation restoration, oyster reef construction, building living shorelines, and public access, just to name a few. Today's speakers will give us a glimpse behind the curtain from the perspective of someone who works in these shallow water habitats and navigates through competing uses, and from the perspective of someone developing a tool to help guide management and restoration activities with these competing uses in mind. And with that, I'm happy to introduce to you our two speakers for today. First up, we have Joe Rieger, Senior Managing Professional Scientist at Anchor QEA, and Karinna Nunez, Senior Research Scientist at the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences Center for Coastal Resource Management. Speakers, I will gracefully let you know if we bump up against time by turning on my camera. And attendees, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat as we go along. We'll be pulling them out and discussing them during our Q&A session following the presentations. And if we don't get to your questions during the webinar, we'll give the speakers the opportunity to address them, and we'll share that information following this session, and we'll send that out in a follow-up email. And with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Joe.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm just getting my PowerPoint set up here. All right. Is it full screen for everybody?
I see it. It still looks like it's on the regular PowerPoint mode, but it might just be a lag.
Yeah, I have where I'm
There
at.
it goes. I
Okay,
see it in presentation mode.
gotcha. Thanks. Sorry, where I'm at. I don't have great connection. So, well, good afternoon, everyone, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I am Joe Rieger. I'm with Anchor QEA. I've been here for about a year. Prior to this, many of you probably worked with me or have known me where I worked at Elizabeth River Project for 22 years. And shallow water habitat has really been the main focus of my career over 25 years working in this area. And I was really, when the Caesar report came out, I was like, wow, someone else that cares about shallow water habitat. But I totally understand this conflict that we have with putting projects in, and I have experienced it personally. And I will cover a number of projects that I worked on that where we had just that issue. So let's get started here. All right. So first of all, I think everyone knows this, but the importance of shallow water habitat are manyfold. One, they are essential nursery habitat for finfish and other crustaceans. The habitats that exist in these areas provide improved water quality. They are highly productive, both primary and secondary, and they contribute significantly to the overall system improvements. We also see that there's structures, natural and people-made structures in place in these areas to reduce ongoing erosional impacts to the uplands and near shore. And these habitats also provide flood and storm protections. And so there's multiple benefits. We could go on all day, but I think everyone who's attending realizes that these are important areas. And because of that, we also realize that habitats that have been impacted over the years exist in these areas, oyster reefs, living shorelines. And as a result, when they are impacted, we look at trying to complete projects to restore those systems. And that's when we have this user conflict. I'd like to just mention that everyone seems to have their own definition of shallow water habitat. Here on the down in Hampton Roads, we developed a white paper while we were developing a mitigation strategy for the impacts of shallow water habitat. And so down here in Hampton Roads, specifically Elizabeth River, there are mitigation requirements for impacting shallow water habitat. Typically there are, but the Corps has been leaning more towards requiring compensation for the impacts of these areas. And so one thing that was not happening is no one was on the same page about why is this important? What is shallow water habitat? And so we brought a committee together where we really defined that. And for down here, we're looking at about 6.5 feet and less. And so that was determined. We worked with a number of folks at VIMS on this, looking at the photic zone in this specific area, along with literature review. So, why are these areas important? This is a paper that was put out in Bioscience, and it talked about the overall importance of these different types of habitat in shallow water areas. And so here in the Mid-Atlantic, one thing I do want to just mention is because a lot of people don't think they're that productive, but these coastal inlet bottoms, mud sand bottoms, are seen as some of the most important from all the way to the North Atlantic, all the way down to southern Florida. And it evaluates these different types of habitats that we typically find in shallow water habitat areas. And it really does, it's an eye opener when you start looking at the importance, especially for finfish. And when you add on the other organisms like crustaceans and whatnot, some of these would actually probably be elevated. But again, I think a good resource, and I know there's a lot out there, but this is one that as we were developing our mitigation strategy for down here, this was a report that was helpful to us. So This is a typical project that we kind of think about down here. This is a project that was completed back in 2010. It's here in Norfolk between the Grammy Street Bridge and the Lafayette Bridge. So this was a large living shoreline and oyster reef that was created in a nearshore habitat. And the reef was made out of crushed concrete and shell. And then adjacent to the shoreline, against this tidal marsh, we put a sill structure that was made out of oyster castles. And we didn't get too much pushback on this particular project, but this started kind of our effort with Chesapeake Bay Foundation on implementing oyster reefs and living shorelines in the shallows back in 2009, 2010. And then that went well. This one didn't. Three projects that we worked with CBF on to implement. We were doing the design and we were doing the permit and construction oversight. Reef. This is in the Lafayette River down here in Norfolk. It is a tributary to the Elizabeth River. Reef 1 was in Crab Creek. Reef 2 was just off of Hampton Boulevard Bridge in front of a Navy installation. And Reef 3 was the mouth of another creek. And so we worked with all the landowners to get permission to do these and adjacent property owners. Reef 1, for example, there was a submerged rock sill structure that boats would hit all the time. So, the homeowner and I were saying, hey, listen, let's put a reef on both sides. We'll put a danger sign about the reef, a pile with the sign. It'll save lives and boats, and we'll get some habitat out of it. And we thought we were doing the right thing. And we talked to who we thought was the public. And Reef 2, the same thing. It was a reef balls in about 6 feet of water with a reef being built up to the intertidal area. And then Reef 3 was a subaqueous reef. So we put these out, put them out for permit comment, thought everything was going well. And then the Crab Creek residents asked for a meeting. And I would say it was probably one of the most eye-opening experiences in my career. I didn't know what I was walking into. A lot of mad residents, a lot of people yelling, and it was very uncomfortable for myself. And I think the regulatory agency that was representing the state at this meeting. And so afterwards, we came back and said, okay, we need to learn from this. What can we do to because all three of these reefs were going to be taken off taken off and no project was going to happen. So then we said, well, let's go and let's ask them to go on a boat ride, the most vocal people. Let's take them out. If they don't like these sites, let's see if we can find sites that they think are appropriate and make them part of this process. And so we did just that. And Reef 1 and Reef 3 were actually moved more up towards the Virginia Zoo, if you're familiar, which the reefs are today are doing great up there. Reef 2 actually moved forward. And the reason that it moved forward is because the residents thought it was a lot shallower where we were putting these reef balls. We went out and showed them that the actual depth was deeper than they anticipated. And so they were fine with that. And the reason that they had issues with all these reefs is because they felt that they should have the ability to drive their boats anywhere they wanted, right? And that these could be obstructions to navigation. And so, we had to make them part of the process. And I thought I was doing the right process, but I did not include enough stakeholders. And so that was a lessons learned, and you'll see that here coming up. Example 2 was actually where I worked when I was at Elizabeth River Project. We worked with a local shipyard, which wanted to dredge an area that was about 2 to 4 feet deep. They wanted to go to about 40 feet. And so we know the significant impacts that can happen going from shallow water to deep water habitat. And so this was the conflict, is that there was going to be such an ecological impact on the system. And, at the time, there was no mitigation or requirement for offsetting these impacts. And so we met with the company a number of times, and, we did not see eye to eye, but eventually the Corps required mitigation or at least a habitat project to be completed, which was a 2.5-acre oyster reef in return for the dredging of this area which a dry dock was going to be placed. And so, well, that was more of a regulatory forced requirement. What did come out of that is our understanding, and a take-home message is like, not everyone understands why shallow water is important. If you don't work in this realm, if you don't understand the importance of it, and also the ecological impacts that can happen when you dredge these areas. We set up that committee I mentioned that was developed the white paper for the mitigation strategy, and that went a long way to help to educate a lot of the companies along the river, at least about the importance, at least about what we were calling shallow water, and establishing that with them and having them agree with that. And then also providing some guidance suggested guidance to the regulatory agencies about when mitigation might be required and not. And that actually helped the permittees, because then going in, they had an idea if it was going to be required or not, because before this, there was no idea if it was going to be required or not. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. So this helped to establish at least open communication with a partner on the river. And then the most recent one that we're going through is, thin layer placement. And many of you probably know about this technique. And so this comes down to more of can be user, can be also how the site looks afterwards, conflict, the visual of it, and then also the ecological temporal impact of placing sediments on marshes. So the idea here is you place anywhere from 1 to 12 inches of material onto a marsh. The idea is that material helps the marsh keep pace with sea level rise and give it some extra life over time, because as we know, we're going to lose a significant amount of our tidal marshes here in Virginia and Maryland. And so this method is reusing material and placing it on marshes where there is a temporal impact of loss of vegetation, but it either grows back through if it's thin. If it's thicker, you have the seed base revegetating the site. And then after about 3 to 4 years, you have a marsh that is typically vegetated back out. And after 5, you usually don't see the difference, but you'll be able to give that boost to the marsh. And so here, I think a lot of this conflict is working with regulatory agencies to hear their concerns, work with them towards a process where this type of application might be allowed, especially here in Virginia. And it's been applied in Maryland and Delaware. But really trying to get at the crux of, do we lose all of our marshes, or are we going to try to save a handful of them through this process? So we are working down here on trying to get 3 projects permitted. So I think this is like one of the future. It's not exactly shallow water, but it is, and also we've dealt a number of times with sill structures, rock sill structures, where boaters want to pull up, and putting them in can be a conflict with accessing different types of properties. And, I think a lot of times it comes down to educating and doing the outreach early on. So lessons learned. Conduct early and extensive stakeholder outreach beyond just the adjacent property owners. I can't stress this enough. I think a lot of times people think that, hey, we don't need to do this, or the outreach is to just the regulatory agencies. I find that this is the most challenging of them all. Develop a balanced and common ground solution addressing both habitat and user needs. So you're not going to win every battle. And if you think you are, you're going to lose a lot. So that's where we need to find a middle ground and like even that example with the Crab Creek folks is, we could have lost all those reefs, but instead we stuck it out. We took them out, we made them part of the process, and we didn't get exactly what we wanted. They didn't get exactly what they wanted, but the project still moved forward. Engage individuals directly, individuals or groups directly who may oppose the project, and listen to their concerns early. This was taught to me by one of my former colleagues is that if you have a very vocal person, one person or two people, go and have coffee with them, go and have lunch with them. Don't let that stir, because that can generate more people by that person talking. So try to go and listen, try to develop a relationship. And with that, I think you'll get a lot more completed, a lot more on the ground than you will with trying to fight people that have that type of passion. Clear communication on project goals and benefits. A lot of times as scientists, we do not do that. And so I do think we need to communicate very clearly and not in scientific ways. We need to talk at a level that is a fifth grade level. And that is really important because we live this in the science world, but a lot of people don't. And then incorporate public access and recreation and project planning to reduce user conflicts. So again, just providing people to get out on the water to appreciate these habitats, so then they're willing to support them. So here's my contact. I'm happy. Well, I'm not taking questions now, but if you have questions and we don't get to them today, please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Joe. We'll be sure to share your contact information out as a follow-up as well. And before we get into the Q&A, we're going to hear from our other speaker, Karinna. So Karinna, I will turn it over to you now.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, share my screen here. Can you see the presentation?
Yep, we're good to go.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Well, hello everyone. My name is Karinna Nunez. I am a senior research scientist and the geospatial modeling manager at the Center for Coastal Resource Management at VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I'm very excited to be here today and share with you how geospatial decision support tools, especially the VIMS shoreline management model, can help support more transparent and science-based management decisions. So here's the roadmap for today's presentation. I'll begin with the shallow water management context in the Chesapeake Bay and why shoreline decisions are becoming increasingly important. Then I will introduce the VIMS shoreline management model and explain how it supports site-specific and science-based shoreline recommendations. Next, I'll highlight how the model uses decision logic and ecological considerations to identify suitable shoreline management approaches. I'll then discuss how the model can support restoration, resilient planning, and regional coastal management applications. And finally, I'll close up with some key takeaways for managing shoreline protection and habitat priorities in shallow water systems. So as we all are aware here, and Joe, he articulated very well in his presentation, shallow water habitats are one of the most productive areas in the Chesapeake Bay. These areas, as we all know, support fisheries and benthic productivity, nutrient cycling, shoreline stabilization, water quality improvement, carbon sequestration, and also public access and recreation. But at the same time, these habitats are increasingly pressured by dredging and navigation expansion, sea level rise, coastal developing, also shoreline hardening, and specifically competing restoration priorities. So the challenge is not simply protecting one habitat type, but understanding how shallow water systems function together as connected ecological systems. This is especially important as shoreline management decisions become increasingly tied to broader Chesapeake Bay restoration and resilience goals. So historically, shoreline management focused primarily on erosion control and property protection. However, today we recognize that shoreline hardening can alter shallow water habitats, sediment dynamics, habitat connectivity, and ecological function. Several studies have shown that conventional shoreline armoring can result in the loss of living resources along impacted shoreline. So because of this, there has been an increasing effort to identify shoreline management strategies that provide erosion protection while minimizing impacts to shallow water habitats. This has contributed to the growing interest in living shorelines and other nature-based shoreline management approaches. So in order to support a more comprehensive coastal management approach, BIMS developed the Shoreline Management Model, or SMM, to inform, assess, enhance, and streamline regulatory decisions by identifying best management practices for tidal shoreline erosion control. So the purpose of the model is to support science-based shoreline management decisions by identifying suitable shoreline management approaches, supporting living shoreline implementation, highlighting ecological conflicts, and improving consistency in shoreline recommendations. So the model does not only identify where living shorelines are possible, it also helps identify where ecological conflicts may exist, where shoreline, for example, hardening may create additional impacts and where additional review may be needed in certain sections of the shorelines. This becomes especially important in the Chesapeake Bay shallow water environment, where restoration priorities frequently overlap. So the purpose of the model is to assess this, as I mentioned, the site suitability for living shoreline approaches at any given location and provide shoreline management best practice recommendation for both natural and currently defended shorelines, where erosion has been identified as a problem that needs to be addressed. It also flags areas where ecological conditions should be considered more carefully. So overall, the model supports more resilient shoreline strategies and also encourages an integrated approach to coastal management by supporting a more balanced approach to shoreline management that considers both erosion protection and ecological function. The SMM is a spatially explicit model that incorporates, as you can see, a great suite of fine-scale coastal conditions and characteristics to provide a shoreline management recommendation, specifically including where living shorelines alternatives are suitable as appropriate method for erosion control. So one important strength of the model is that recommendations are based on actual site conditions rather than one-size-fits-all approach. This is important in the Chesapeake Bay shallow water systems where shoreline energy, the bathymetry, habitat presence, and land use can vary significantly over short distances. So recommended erosion control strategies are based on decision trees developed by scientists at VEMS. These decision trees are the foundation of the model and are based on current scientific knowledge of how shorelines respond to natural conditions and anthropogenic pressures, as well as best professional judgment from over 4,000 shoreline site visits. So all these allow the model to support more consistent shoreline management recommendation while still recognizing local environmental variability. Areas of spatial consideration are also flagged in the model. These recommendations are assigned based on site-specific features, such as presence of submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, which may present an ecological conflict. Also shoreline with, for example, steep banks on highly developed uplands, among others. For example, the model flags where SAV is present or is likely to move to recover, where shoreline hardening could interfere with habitat connectivity, or, for example, where unique geomorphic features require additional caution. These frameworks support a more system-based approach to decision-making, also by helping managers evaluate trade-offs before projects are permitted or constructed. This is a conceptual diagram that illustrates the major components of the shoreline management model. Input to the model includes a wide array of data for considering physical shoreline features, ecological attribute, human infrastructure, and also regulatory designations. This holistic dataset approach ensures recommendations are grounded on site-specific coastal dynamics. So based on the site conditions, the model generates a spatial linear feature along the shoreline with recommended preferred shoreline-based management practices for defended and undefended shorelines. In the case of Virginia, the model produces 24 possible shoreline management recommendations. It is different in other states. I'll tell you that in a little bit. And these recommendations they're going to fall, these 24, within these categories, either within living shorelines or replace a structure with living shoreline, traditional approach, special considerations, or no action needed. Each recommendation provides information along the shoreline about the best management practice that should be applied in that particular extent of the shoreline for erosion control. The model also includes an oyster structure suitability component, another branch, which identify areas where also oyster-based approaches may be appropriate for erosion control and habitat enhancement. So together, these outputs create a spatial explicit decision support system that help users make more informed site-specific shoreline management decisions. So statistics and current model outputs in Virginia can be visualized in the Virginia Coastal Resource Tool. And user can visualize the spatial data from here, download the GIS files, spatial data set, read definition, and also access to the technical documentation. These visualization tools are important because they help make complex shoreline information more accessible to, for example, regulators, local government, consultants, and also to the property owners. So the goal is to support a more transparent and consistent shoreline management decision, and this type of tool helps users understand where shoreline management recommendation may intersect, for example, with habitat concerns or restoration priorities. For example, in the coastal viewer, user can, for example, visualize the output in an interactive map. Here's an example of the SMM spatial output. On the left, we can see the line feature displaying the best management practice recommendations along the shoreline. These are a section of Gloucester County here in Virginia. We can see the different recommendations depending on the site-specific conditions. For example, in this case, some areas are suitable for living shorelines. Others where it's recommended replace the existing structure with living shoreline. Some areas that living shoreline are not suitable, so a traditional structure is recommended. In other areas that no action is needed, which means that in that section of the shoreline is stable. On your right, you can see the output of the oyster structure branch of the model, highlighting areas where oyster structures could be used for erosion control and habitat enhancement. Special consideration or ecological conflicts also are highlighted. The model result can also be visualized through dashboards that summarize shoreline management recommendation and shoreline statistics by localities. These tools provide a more also user-friendly way for local governments and stakeholders to evaluate shoreline conditions and management opportunities at a broader spatial scale. These dashboards allow users to see and summarize shoreline management recommendations by locality, and also evaluating patterns across larger geographic regions. Again, this type of information can support resilient planning, shoreline management prioritization, and restoration planning efforts. So the model has been calibrated and validated along Virginia Chesapeake Bay shoreline. The model results are largely consistent with field recommendations. In other words, they match shoreline management recommendations made by scientists based on on-site observations during shoreline evaluation visits. So we conducted a validation study comparing the model output with expert shoreline management recommendations made by BIM scientists during these field visits. These field sites represented a diverse range of shoreline energy conditions, ensuring that the validation captured a variety of real-world scenarios. So we use an error matrix to measure classification accuracy and calculate the kappa coefficient, which tell us how much agreement exists beyond chance between the field observations and recommendations and the model output. In this case, the kappa statistic value that we got is 0.72, which can be translated to a substantial agreement. So these results also demonstrate that the model's recommendation closely align with expert professional judgment and remain consistent across varying coastal conditions. So here at the bottom also is the link, the information for the peer review publication if you would like to learn more about the details of the validation process. So the scale of these applications varies from parcel level to regional applications. Although the model was initially developed for shoreline erosion management, its application continued to expand. Today, the model supports habitat planning, shoreline resilience, restoration prioritization, and ecological conflict screening. So the model helps identify where shoreline protection strategies may better align with broader restoration goals and where additional caution may be needed. Possible application of the shoreline management model vary from, for example, from habitat restoration to climate resilience, to implementation of natural nature-based solutions, to water quality, and any combination of those. Examples of, for example, an application is estimating, for example, pollutant load reduction. If living shorelines were implemented everywhere, the model suggests they may be suitable. And this is actually something that we are currently working with Maryland Department of Environment, using the output of the model for these applications. The model also reveals sites where currently defended shoreline also might be retrofitted with living shoreline approaches. So this model has been developed for Virginia, but can also be exported and has been actually exported and customized for other coastal regions to meet their management and regulatory needs. So as I showed before, here is a map showing where the model has been applied. Again, one of the strengths of this framework is that it can be adapted regionally. And actually, there are some countries in Europe and in South America that actually are also using this model right now. So although the scientific foundation remains consistent, the recommendation and terminology can be customized to reflect regional shoreline conditions, habitat types, and regulatory approaches. This flexibility has supported successful application across all these multiple coastal states. So some of these recommendation definitions were customized to reflect regional terminology and also particular regulations. So far here in the United States, the model has been applied in Virginia, Maryland, areas in North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, and we're currently working in the state of New York. So now I'm going to just show you a quick overview of the different tools that has been actually that are displaying the output of the shoreline management model in other regions. Here is the one from Texas. So you will have a copy of the presentation. So I put over there the URL in case you would like to learn more about the different applications. Here is the one for Alabama and Louisiana. This is a living shoreline site suitability and decision making tool that we developed in partnership with Troy University and Louisiana Sea Grant. This is the one that we collaborate with for Tampa Bay. We partnered with Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. And this one is the one for Maryland. And one of the things, so we're partnering with Maryland Department of Environment. We're working on this under an EPA grant. And one of the unique things that I really like about Maryland that actually here in Virginia, we're using the model for guidance, but in Maryland, actually, this is part of the output of the model and the output of the model are part of the regulatory process. So they use the model output for the permit application review process. Okay, so to conclude, here are some takeaways. Shallow water habitats are highly valuable and increasingly affected by competing priorities. Shoreline management decisions directly influence habitat resilience and restoration success. The BIM shoreline management model support more consistent science-based shoreline management decisions by integrating shoreline conditions, ecological consideration, and management objectives into a unified framework. So the model help identify ecological conflict early in the planning process, including areas where shoreline management like SAB protection, oyster restoration, and other shallow water priorities may overlap. Nature-based shoreline approaches can help reduce impact also while supporting cost ecological function. And also, and finally, effective restoration depend on selecting the right approach for the right location based on habitat suitability and also the likelihood of long-term persistence. And with that, here is the website with the URL and the link and the QR code for if you would like to learn more about the model. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy now to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karinna, for sharing your model. So we've got a few clarifying questions, and I encourage others in the audience, if you have questions as well, drop them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. I'm going to start with a few clarifying questions that came in for Joe. So Joe, some of the questions were about thin layer placement. And one of them was asking how much additional elevation from the placement of material is considered thin layer placement.
So, from the original. So, you know, there's we could talk, you could have a whole separate session on this. I would say, you know, typically you're looking at 0 to 12 inches.
Great. And related question is, has thin layer placement been considered for a BMP in Virginia to facilitate permitting?
To facilitate permitting. Don't quite understand that question. If the question is, has a thin layer placement project been permitted in Virginia? The answer is no. We have a project right now that we are starting that process.
Great, thanks, Joe. And then the last one for you before I've got one for Karinna is, with some of your restoration projects, how have you been incorporating any pre or post restoration monitoring for fish and other critters?
So for the oyster work that we did with CBF, that work, there was fish monitoring on each of the reefs that were built, so that we did have some pre and post monitoring of fish species. And I think that data set runs about 10, 15 years. So yeah, it's no longer being done. You know, there, as everyone knows, there's not funding to, you know, fund monitoring long term. So so that was conducted, you know, before, for a lot of reefs before and then after. So there is an existing data set for the Lafayette reefs.
Great. Thanks so much for that additional info. So Karinna, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about who the primary users were, where the model was being applied. Can you tell at what level? Like, is this primarily at the state level or smaller local governments that are using the tool to help guide some of their restoration activities?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, actually, the answer would be all of the above. Like, we have as an audience, and you know, they consume the output from these models. It range from property owners. We have people that actually see, because this is a very spatial explicit and highly resolved model outputs. So you can actually see a parcel level. So we have maybe sometimes property owners have questions. They have actually called and reached out to us because they visit the tools and they would like to learn more or understand maybe why they got this permit or why they were not allowed to do this. So we explain, we have the information in the tool and the model, and they can understand why are the particular, you know, site conditions that, you know, favor or not that decision about the permit. We can help them. So VEMIS is not a regulatory agency. So what we do, we provide the science behind to support the decision-making process. And that is what we wanted to get the best science that we, you know, can provide, and being very transparent with that. And that is what we are trying to portray also in this type of interactive tools. Model outputs also are used at local level. I know a lot of localities, PDCs are using them for project, for restoration. Also at state level, because also help us just to see regionally, you know, areas and highlight areas with maybe be, some for coastal resilience, but also for targeting and prioritizing different areas for restoration.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question for you, Karinna. It says, I saw that your model dashboard for Virginia highlighted sections of the shoreline where nearshore projects could conflict with shellfish aquaculture leases. Is the Maryland model already or planning to incorporate shellfish lease data in a similar way?
Okay, so the dashboard that I showed today, this is from the Virginia. So for Virginia, actually, we're currently working on a NOAA project with CCM, and we actually have updated the model. So we are the latest version of the model is 6.0, which have a lot of enhancement, but also has this new branch for oyster suitability. The one that we applied, the last one that we applied in Maryland actually is 5.1, which it did not have that branch. So this is, but that being said, we're still working now with Maryland Department of Environment. Actually, based on the model output, we are running different applications. Examples that I mentioned right now, like what is going to be the benefit of implementing living shoreline. So we are creating this kind of calculator to estimate, weight reduction and also sediment and nutrient load reduction if those living shoreline projects are implemented. So we're in that stage. After we finish that project, I think the idea is keep working with them and maybe apply the upgraded version of the model. But as it is right now, it's not has been run from Maryland yet.
Great, thank you. We'll look for that update then. One of the questions that came in with our registration, actually a couple of them were focusing on, so we've got all of these different competing uses that have to be considered as you're planning any kind of restoration activity. But then how do you also layer in considerations for impacts from a changing climate, either as you're planning a restoration activity or building some of that knowledge into the model tool? So I'll open this up to both of you, and maybe we'll start with Joe for your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the first thing you need to do, and a lot of this is in the new wetland regs that VMRC set out, is come up with a life expectancy of what you want your project to be. So, like for a marsh, if you want it 50 years out, then you should look at typically down here they're using the intermediate high curve, and then project that out and see what those increases are going to look like. And then based off of the increase you're going to see, raise your sill structure. If you're using a sill or whatever structure you're using, raise it by that, add that much more than you typically would to your design, and also set your upper marsh and lower marsh at kind of their highest elevations where they'll exist. We did that at the Ryan Resilience Lab. Kind of what way we were approaching that now is making smaller intertidal restoration areas, and then the high marsh, trying to have more high marsh and expanding that out so that it allows for wetland migration. So I do think that looking at those curves and determining, do you want this project to last 50 years, 20 years, 30 years, and then basing that off of some of those projections.
Great, thanks, Joe. Any thoughts from you, Karinna?
Yeah, I can follow up. Yeah, I agree with Joe said. I think one of the important things, and maybe I'm a little biased because I work a lot in the geospatial world, so I think has been highly useful developing and sharing these kind of interactive tools. So practitioners and as I said before, from the beginning, you can evaluate actually what are the site-specific conditions, make sure that they are, in general, they are nothing in the system is isolated. There are going to be maybe overlaps and, competing resources. Any action that any strategy or management, approach that we would like to implement and need to consider, okay, what is going to be the impact? And I think the first thing is always try to avoid impact. Second would be minimize. But I think with these type of tools and models, what we can highlight is, okay, where are these competitions occur and how we actually what they are affecting more. For example, connectivity. I know for the shallow waters are very important, especially for the connectivity. They connect different type of habitats. And so anything that we implement that had that consideration. And also with that tool, for example, a lot of people are using the model output with also some sea level rise layers that we have also embedded in the Virginia Coastal Resort tool. So you can see actually if it's not just implementing something for now, it's also to see what is the long-term, sustainability of that project. So seeing how that is going to be, that area is going to be affected by sea level rise and assessing that the output of the model or the different type of recommendations or any type of, implementation project that we would like to, put in place, how that is going to be looking in, 20, 30, 50 years. So all that information is available, and we tried also to do, and I would like to go back to something that Joe said at the beginning about outreach and the importance of bring everybody to the table and that communication among the different stakeholders. I think that is also key, and it has to happen from, time zero, from the project.
Mm-hmm.
And I also just add that, over the next 50 years, we're going to be seeing increases in shallow water habitat, right? With sea level rise. I mean, so there's going to be a gain of shallow water habitat. I think what the trick is how do you help these systems adapt that are in place now? In some areas you may have wetland migration, but in urban areas, you probably won't. So, do you let those marshes entirely disappear, or do you look at alternative ways to have them adapt to sea level rise? So, yeah, but the shallow water, just even in like subaqueous and intertidal areas, those will increase just because water levels are going to increase over time. So I think that's something else that we need to keep in mind, is that we're going to have extensively expanding shallow water, but at the same time, a lot of that shallow water that might be seagrass now, Spartina alterniflora will probably be seagrass in areas that are have significant seagrass beds. So I do think there will be a significant change in the system in the next 50 and 60 years because of sea level rise.
Great. Thanks for your thoughts. Joe, I had a follow-up question for you about stakeholder engagement. So it was a great segue, Karinna, that you brought that back up to the topic. I'm curious, as you're considering a new restoration activity where you want to work, how are you thinking through who you might want to engage and what the best mechanism is to get them involved with a particular project?
I mean, obviously, you want to start with the landowners and adjacent landowners, and then from there, I typically think, is there a civic league adjacent? If they have a civic league or some kind of community neighborhood, that is a way to get the word out and attend one of their meetings, talk about the project. As you get further away from this project site, typically there's less, you have less impact on users. But that's typically, what I do for upland owners. And then the next thing I would look at is, okay, next to this, are there crabbers? Are there oyster, is there oyster harvesting occurring? So, then kind of looking at the human use of the adjacent site and trying to outreach to those individuals. And then finally, the biological, do you have seagrass, or do you have some type of special habitat that's there that you need to be aware of that you may run into a regulatory issue with? So, I think you have to kind of think of it from the different systems approach. The upland human element, the on water element, which can be, watermen and other uses that are out there, and looking at if there's leases adjacent, and then the biological element and engaging those stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing that if I may follow up with that, it's also just the importance, also just to follow up with the importance of property owners. Like we need to also remember that more than 80% of our shoreline in Virginia is privately owned. So, having that connection with property owners, that outreach, have that information available, make them part of the process. Right now at VIMS also, VIMS has the mandate also to generate and maintain shoreline inventories. So condition of shoreline inventories and tidal marsh inventories. Those are baseline data, and for example, those are part of the input for these and other models. But also, it's very important to have those data sets because we prepare for the future, and we are going to forecast how the conditions, how habitats are going to be or where they're going to be. We need to know exactly how we are right now. So that information is very important. So now we're not only doing our survey and using, deep learning, machine learning involving technology, but also we are also now incorporating community science into the process. So we have a lot of property owners that actually, with mobile apps that we have developed, they are help us to collect data. And that has been a great venue for outreach and to teach and help to, understand the benefits of nature-based solutions and what are the habitats and what is with sea level rise. So I think at the end of the day, it's everything about also human relationship. And I agree with Joe with that. And I think having that kind of connection with the community, especially because a lot of it's private, the shoreline is private right now in Virginia. I think that is very important.
Thanks so much. And I just want to give a big thank you to both you, Joe and Karinna, for joining us today and kicking off what will undoubtedly be one of many conversations that we'll be having here at the Roundtable, as well as in other forums about what work will look like as we move more into the shallows. I know we had a lot of other questions that were submitted during registration, and we've made note of them. And some of them I think we can package together and will make great themes for future roundtables. So we'll follow up in that way, as well as in our follow-up email that we typically send out after these. But again, thank you so much, Karinna and Joe, for helping us to kick off the conversation. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us for today's conversation and for your attention and your great questions. Again, we'll be following up and probably having more conversations in the future. Stay tuned. We will have our next roundtable webinar in June on the 17th. So we hope to see you all there. And thanks again, everyone. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.